Yeah, I have that in front of me, and I just looked it up, brother. And this is the original Aramaic New Testament in plain English, and it says his head and his hair were white as wool. So the translation I have, it says his head and his hair were white as wool. But I don't let the Aramaic conquer the Greek because the Greek's the original. We have older manuscripts for the Greek.
Well, first of all, we Hebrews, Hebrew Israelites deal with their language. We were speaking Aramaic. So I'm not
taking. You speak Aramaic.
Hebrews did speak Aramaic.
No, do you speak Aramaic?
I don't have to speak Aramaic. You cannot try to say, oh, you're going to deal with the Greek and you're going to take that as more manuscripts. But then because I don't speak 100% Aramaic or 100% fluent biblical Hebrew, we can't use the Hebrew. When my people is Hebrews, they're not Greeks. That's just another language. They was Hellenized.
Why did God choose to write the New Testament in Greek? Why do you have a problem with God's choice?
I don't have a problem with it. Wait a minute. So why did he choose to write it in the Aramaic Hebrew? It's in Aramaic Hebrew too.
The translation. The translation's in the Aramaic. I mean, I'm talking about when Paul wrote his letters. He wrote them in Greek. When Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke, it's in Greek.
Yes, and some Gospels of Matthew is in Hebrew. You know that. Parts of it is in Hebrew.
There's a theory about that from one church father. We got to go by manuscripts, right? And the oldest manuscripts of the Bible across the board are all in Greek. So to have a Hebrew priority theory, which you're advocating, you have to do it regardless of the fact that there's not the manuscripts there. But it really doesn't change anything. You can't turn Jesus into something he wasn't simply by using another translation.
Like how white people turn from white by using their translation saying that he was Caesar Borgia, second son of Pope Alexander VI of Rome.
What Bible says that Jesus was Cesare Borgia?
No, they don't. I'm saying like
exactly
white people did, how they changed him to somebody else, but we not changing him. The Bible says Christ was a man of color. He had hair as wool, not like, meaning as wool, like we have hair as wool. So
you're saying it's talking about his texture?
So what? Well,
I'm asking you. You're saying that's talking about the texture of his hair, right, Shar?
Yes. What is wool then? If it's
okay,
wool,
Shar.
What is wool?
What is the texture of snow?
You tell me. It's ice. What's the texture?
Right.
Of snow?
So,
like
so
snow.
What race? What ethnicity? Shar. What ethnicity has texture like snow?
You tell me. It didn't say his hair was as snow.
Have you read Revelation?
Yeah, it said white like snow. It didn't say it was the texture of snow.
Exactly the same thing with the wool. Vocab Malone aired a discussion with some gentleman from FOPE, and there was a brief portion in which a gentleman from that group tried to tell Vocab that Revelation 1:14 reads in a significantly different way in Aramaic. And I thought it might be worthwhile to make a short video which explores that claim, and look at a relevant text or two. This clip will run for a little less than a minute.
Christ is in color. You go in the Daniel, it says the Ancient of Days, the Most High have hair like wool. Well, not hair.
No, it doesn't, Shar. I don't mean to be rude, but it does not say that.
It says hair of poor. It says hair of pure wool. It says that. It says, and when you read in the Aramaic New Testament, not the Greek, because the Greek says like wool when you read in King James, but I have the Aramaic New Testament. It says Christ's hair is of wool, not like wool. So the Greek it differentiates from the Aramaic New Testament. That's another problem. When you go into the Hebrew New Testament, it says wool, of pure wool, not like. And, according to scriptures of him having woolly hair, which we do have.
Hold on. That's not what the Bible says. It says hair white like wool, white like snow.
Oh, listen, that's the Greek. We spoke Hebrew.
Before we go there, because
the New Testament, the Aramaic written says of pure wool. It don't say.
So that gentleman made a reference to the Aramaic version of the New Testament. And as far as the book of Revelation is concerned, I can only assume that he meant the Peshitta, the ancient Syrian Aramaic translation of the Bible. And I have a physical copy of the Peshitta here. On the cover, it reads Kitab Qatisha, the Holy Book. And we'll open this book up and turn to the New Testament, which is right here. And the title there reads Kitab Diyatiki Hadatha, the book of the New Testament or New Covenant. And we're going to go to the end of that book, naturally, which is to the book of Revelation. And we find that here. The title is Gelyana de Yohanan, the Revelation of John. And let's go to the relevant verse, which again is Revelation 1:14. And here's the verse right here. Here's verse 14. And I'll transcribe that first part into the corresponding Hebrew or Ashuri characters for those who aren't familiar with the Syriac script. And now I'd like to very quickly run through this 8-word stretch here. So the first word is Rishe, which means his head. The word Rish means head, and then there's a third person masculine singular possessive suffix on the end there. The next word is Dain, which I find a bit difficult to translate here, but it means something like so, right? So the opening two words, the Rishe Dain, might be rendered so his head. The third word is Wasa'ire, and his hair. Sa'ir is equivalent to the biblical Hebrew word se'ar, which, for example, appears in Genesis 25:25. And here that word too has the same possessive suffix on it. So his head and his hair. The fourth word is hewar, which means white. So his head and his hair were white. Now, the fifth word, which is relevant to this discussion, is ek, which is a preposition. It means like or as, and as in as with one s. And the sixth word is amra, the wool. So his head and his hair were white as wool, or white like wool. Then the seventh word is wa'ek. It's that same preposition, meaning like or as, that we just looked at a moment ago. And then the last word is talga, the snow. So his head and his hair were white as wool, as white as snow, right? Or white like wool, white like snow. But I think the central point here, in contrast to what the gentleman had told Vocab in that clip, is that the preposition ek does mean like or as. But if that gentleman or anyone else would like to propose some other interpretation of that preposition, it's worth noting that it appears twice, both before the word for wool and before the word for snow. So if one is going to handle this text consistently, one would hope that a person treats the preposition ek the same way in this sentence, right? In other words, whatever one thinks the preposition ek means before the word for wool should likewise be what it means before the word for snow. Now, before I close this video, it's worth recalling that the gentleman also made a passing reference to the Hebrew New Testament. Now, there are multiple Hebrew translations of the New Testament, but I'd like to show this fun book I have here, which binds the Masoretic Tanakh together with a Hebrew translation of the New Testament, into a single volume. And as we crack this volume open, we can turn to the New Testament portion, and you see at the bottom that this particular Hebrew translation of the New Testament is the translation of Franz Delitzsch. And turning now to the end, to the book of Revelation, we find that here the title is Chazon Yochanan, and now we'll go down to the relevant verse, which again is Revelation 1:14, which can be found right here. Rosho us'aro lebanim ketzemer, tzahar kasheleg. And I can put this parsing of that portion on the screen for interested readers to peruse at their leisure. Feel free to pause the video and look it over. But I think the most salient point here is, again, that preposition. In this case, it's a prefixed kaf, which I marked in red. And it's the same preposition put before both the word for wool and the word for snow. Now, on a minor note, one might prefer that the word tzahar be rendered bright instead of white. But I think that's a minor point. The central point here is the common preposition and attempting to take a consistent approach to this text. Now, perhaps that gentleman had in mind a different Hebrew translation of the New Testament. That's certainly possible. If so, he's most welcome to leave a comment on this video to clarify such, to share what translation of the New Testament he had in mind.
See, brother, it's literally right next to each other. You want one to be describing texture and one to be describing color, but they're both describing the color.
Bro, people have white hair when they get white. Over years, people hair turn pure white. That's how people hair turn gray. It goes to gray, then it goes to white. It's telling you the color, because snow is the color of white. So now we want to act like we don't know wool hair. You don't know what wool is, so nobody don't have wool hair now.
You froze, Kuna.
I never said anything like that.
Mentioned that I also have a video which looks at the same text in the ancient Geʻez or Ethiopic translation of the Bible. On your screen is part of the Greek text of Revelation 1:14, the 14th verse of the first chapter of the book of Revelation, the last book of the Christian Bible. And this is the portion in which Christ's hair is likened to wool and snow. And this text is open to two possible interpretations. And the difference between those views centers on this word here, leukon, which means white. It could be understood as an adjective modifying the word which precedes it, or as part of a separate thought together with the two words that follow it. In short, this text can be broken into two thoughts, and that specific word can fall in either the first thought or the second thought. Now, to illustrate what I mean, I'll divide the text up with different color coding. One way to understand the text is like this, where the first three words, leukai os erion, white like wool, is one thought, and then the next three words, leukon os chion, white like snow, forms a second thought. The translation in the King James Version reflects this interpretation of the text. However, the text could alternatively be understood this way, where the first four words, leuke os erion lekon, are a single thought, meaning white like white wool, and then the other two words simply mean like snow. In this reading, the word which was underlined a moment ago is part of the first thought. The second use of the word white is an adjective modifying the word wool. This was the interpretation taken by the Geneva Bible and also by the Douay-Rheims translation, and the latter shouldn't be surprising, as it was also the interpretation taken by the ancient Latin Vulgate. And today, the ESV, the NASB, and the NRSV side with this second interpretation as well. And with all that in mind, I would now like to turn to the ancient Ge'ez translation of that verse, which you now see on your screen. Or more specifically, this is the portion of the verse describing his head and his hairs. This actually doesn't include the part of the verse which likens his eyes to fire. But that aside, the question I want to explore in this video is this. Which of the two interpretations which we just looked at does the ancient Ge'ez translation of this verse side with? So in this video, I'm going to go through the different elements of this text just so that any interested viewer who might not be familiar with Ge'ez can nonetheless be fully familiar with this text. And along the way, I might also mention some corresponding terms in other languages. So jumping right in, we begin with the conjunction, which is the standard conjunction across the Semitic languages, meaning and I highlighted this one in red, and I'll be highlighting all the conjunctions in this text as we go through this text, as precisely where the conjunctions are found will be relevant to the question of which of the two interpretations is settled on by this particular translation. And then after that, after the conjunction, we have the word tsa'ada, which means white. Then the second word is re'isu, meaning his head. And this word, Ge'ez, corresponds to the Hebrew word rosh and the Arabic word ras. And it's also the ancestor of the Amharic word ras, although that's spelled now, as if I understand correctly, it's written without the aleph. But whatever the case, the Amharic word ras is what you get in, it forms part of the phrase or the title, ras teferi. But that aside, if I can share a quick and, in my opinion, interesting side note, as is noted in different works on Ge'ez grammar, this construction, re'isu, his head, is often used to mean more broadly his self or himself. I mention that because I wonder if the translator understood this as being limited to just Christ's head or something more beyond that, perhaps to his entire physical self. It's an interesting question, as I think there are some obvious parallels or at least some obvious overlap between the description of Christ in Revelation 1:14 and the description of Noah in the Ge'ez translation or the Ge'ez text of the 106th chapter of the book of Enoch. And that's a topic I might explore in a future video. But anyway, moving on from that, we then get another conjunction, meaning and. And then we get the word she'irtu, meaning his hairs. And this word, she'irt, is directly related to the biblical Hebrew word se'ar, which means hair. For example, in Genesis 25:25, when Esau is described as ke'aderet se'ar, like a garment of hair, it uses that Hebrew term. And these two terms, the first three letters are basically the same. It's basically shin or sin, and then ayin, and then resh, right? Then we get to the word kama, which means like or like as. Right, it's for comparisons, and it corresponds to the Hebrew kemo and the Arabic kama, and ironically, the Spanish como is similar to these Semitic terms, but that similarity in sound and meaning is merely coincidental, as the Spanish term descends from the Latin quo modo, but that too is a discussion for another time. Now, I marked this construction, kama, in blue because the location of this construction, like the location of the conjunctions, the word or and, the location of these terms is also relevant to the question of the interpretation of this text. And so, moving on from that, we get the word tsemer, which means wool, and others might want to argue it's pronounced demer, like the Arabic dad, but either way, this word means wool. And the word that follows is again the word tsa'ada, which means, as was noted earlier, it means white. So these two words together, tsemer, tsa'ada, can be understood as meaning white wool. But that raises the question, is that how the translator intended it? Well, that question gets answered in the text that follows on the third line, which is wakama bared, and like snow. See, it's the conjunction which is significant here. that conjunction separates this thought on the third line from the thought on the second line. Now, admittedly, a corresponding conjunction does not appear in that location in the Greek text, but it nonetheless captures the ancient translator's understanding of that text, which is to say, the use of the conjunction here in the Geʻez text conveys how the translator understood the Greek text. And by prefixing a conjunction to the second use of kama, the translator separated it from the word which precedes it, right? Which is Sa'ada, meaning white, thus establishing that word as an adjective modifying the word for wool, which again is semer. So a hyper-literal reading of this Ge'ez translation would be, and white his head and his hair, like white wool, and like snow. Now, some might feel this was a bit of a slow walk through the text to get to the answer of the question which I posed at the beginning, but that nonetheless is the answer. The ancient Ge'ez translation unambiguously sides with the view that the text was stating that Christ's head and hairs were white like white wool, and in addition to that, it was also like snow. So the second use of the word white is being employed as an adjective modifying the word wool. And with that, I'll close here. As always, I look forward to any comments, questions, or even criticisms that others may have, so feel free to share your thoughts, whether positive or negative. I don't censor anyone here. And as always, I close by saying, God bless.
I'm just saying the passages you're using don't prove what you want to prove. And I could show you this.
No.
I could show you this. I could show you this.
Stop it. It does.
Is there an ethnicity? Is there an ethnicity, SHAR?
Language?
Is there an ethnicity that has a sword coming out of its mouth?
That's whatever the Messiah has. That's him. We're not the Messiah.
Okay,
Right. So these are symbolic descriptions, SHAR. SHAR, they're symbolic descriptions.